Okay, brilliant. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Embercombe Online. For those of you who don't know about Embercombe, we are a valley in the southwest of England. We're based right on the edge of wild Dartmoor, and we promote and support and inspire people on wilding of places and wilding of people. So tonight's session is very much about wilding people, obviously in places. And I think really, apart from our founder, Mac McCartney, I don't think there is anyone that embodies the work of Embercombe as much as Bill Plotkin does. He is the author of several books, but Soulcraft and Wild Mind are two of our favourites on the Embercombe bookshelf. He is a psychologist and a wilderness guide and the founder of Animas Valley Institute. And actually a lot of the facilitators that teach with us have trained under him. So it's wonderful to have him here tonight. And also, if you haven't checked out what we offer, then please go and do that. We have a masterclass at the end of February online with a couple of the Animas Valley guides on an introduction to Soulcraft. So if you like what we talk about tonight, then please do check that out for more of an in-depth dive. But tonight, very excitingly, Bill is going to be talking about his new book, which is called The Journey of Soul Initiation. I haven't read it yet because it's only just arrived and it hasn't even hit the shelves in the UK yet. So we're here to have a sneak preview. And just a little bit of housekeeping first. We'll talk for about 40 minutes and then we will open the floor for questions. We're going to do that in two ways. One is for people to raise their hands electronically. I'm sure most of you will know how to do that by now. It's along the bottom somewhere. I'm actually not sure. And the other is to post your question in the chat, and we have a couple of people tonight who'll be keeping an eye on that. But please could I ask you not to use the chat until we open the floor for questions, because it can be just very distracting when we're talking. And also to say it's probably going to be a little bit hectic because there are so many of us, and also we'll be trying to take questions for the Facebook live stream as well. So enough of me, our time is short anyway. Bill, welcome to Embercombe Online.
Thank you, Rachel. Great to be with you. I appreciate the invitation. You're one of my favorite people in the world, and it's great to be in conversation with you. And I also would like to say, you know, of course, that I have been to Embercombe once on a visit. Last time I was in Southwest England, and it's such a special place, both on the human level, the human built level, and the other than human level. So I'm excited to be addressing the people tuned in today, because anyone interested in Embercombe will be someone I'd like to be in conversation with. So thanks.
Fantastic, thank you. Thank you for coming. My first question, as I'm sure you can imagine, the journey of soul initiation. Can you say a little bit about what you mean by soul initiation, and maybe even soul itself? What's your definition of soul?
Yeah, well, I don't know how to really explain this, but somehow I knew you were going to ask me that question. And somehow my muse knew that too. So when I woke up this morning, which was just a few hours ago, the muse said to me, hey, here's what you need to say about the journey of soul initiation. Just because you've written a whole book about it doesn't mean you can coherently explain to people quickly what it is. So she just gave me dictation, and I'm actually going to read what she said. So here it is. The journey of soul initiation is the multi-year-long process that enables us to remember who we were born to be and what we were born to do in this lifetime. In some traditions, this is called our original instructions. It's the spiritual adventure that reveals to us what we at Animas Valley Institute call our unique mythopoetic identity, something that cannot be described in terms of any social or vocational role. Our mythopoetic identity communicates to us our unique individual place or niche in the greater Earth community, the wider and deeper web of life on this planet. And embedded in there was my definition of soul, which is, it's an ecological definition, not psychological or spiritual or religious. It is simply this: a thing's unique ecological niche, or eco niche. Okay, the journey of soul initiation, it's the mystical odyssey that shapes us into a visionary artisan of cultural evolution, or as we need now, visionary artisans of cultural regeneration. It's the process, in other words, through which we become true adults, which is to say, soul initiated adults. It's the journey through which we discover our unique individual way to enhance life and to cooperate with evolution. It's what happens during the stage of life that perhaps 80% of contemporary people never reach. The stage I call the cocoon, a stage that a healthy culture would consider late adolescence. It's the essential spiritual adventure that most contemporary societies like ours have lost or forgotten hundreds or even thousands of years ago. It's the journey that all past and present healthy cultures had or have a version of, and all future healthy cultures will have a version of. It's the nature-based process for which we at Animas Valley Institute have been learning for 40 years so far to create a contemporary Western version of, not a version borrowed from any existing or earlier indigenous traditions. And because the journey of soul initiation is so unfamiliar to most everyone, it's probably not what you think it is. So I'll mention some of the things it is not. It's not a rite of passage. It's not a process of healing or therapy. It's not a hero's journey. It's not a vision fast, although it can include one. It's not a psychedelic trip or an entheogenic journey, although it can include one. It's not what Jungian analysts do. It's not shamanism. It's not an initiation weekend for men or women or teens. It's not a puberty rite. It's not a dark night of the soul. It's not a union with the divine, it's not an experience of non-duality, although sometimes it can include that. And last, it's not a way to discover your social or vocational purpose. Okay, that's what the muse said.
Can you tell us what it is then, Bill? So all of those things are what it is not, then the journey of soul initiation. Can you tell us what it is?
Well, that was the first half of what I just read.
Can
like
you
the first part.
Yeah. Can you repeat it then for me,
Okay.
in a nutshell?
Just the first one, the multi-year long process that enables us to remember who we were born to be and what we were born to do in this lifetime, or our original instructions.
Fantastic. My muse, the book that I was reading actually this afternoon, said that the journey of initiation was something to do with the direct experience of purpose. I wondered what you thought about that.
The direct experience of purpose. Yeah, it's but it's you might say it's our ecological purpose. It's this mystical vocation, but not a vocation in everyday middle world cultural terms. It's the mystical place or niche that we were born to take, and it's often confused with social or vocational purpose. Like people often ask themselves, well, wonder what job or career I'll have in this life, or what social role, or what creative project. But soul itself is none of those, because if it's the purpose that we're born with, then it's pre-linguistic and pre-cultural. And so it can't be defined in any of those terms. And the way we come to understand it during the experience that I call a soul encounter is through a glimpse of some kind of metaphor, some symbol or archetype or poem or somatic dance experience that informs us what we are to do in this lifetime. And once we have had that experience with soul encounter, and once that experience has had some time, that visionary experience has had some time to shapeshift our ego, then we're able to choose one or more delivery systems for manifesting that soul purpose, or for carrying our unique gift to the more than earth community. And the delivery systems that people choose could be things that we could call jobs or social roles, etc. But now they're just delivery systems, and the real thing we're doing is embodying our mythopoetic identity. Hope that helped.
Yeah, absolutely. So the way you describe it as a year-long search for your mythopoetic identity, it feels like that should and will obviously be different for everyone. But I am imagining in your book, you are giving some guidelines, framework, instructions for that. I wonder if you would be able to talk about that at all.
Yeah, let me make sure I'm clear. Are you asking about the journey itself is somewhat unique,
Yeah.
or what we discover is obviously unique? So yeah, the journey is unique. My understanding is that each healthy culture has their own way of guiding it or manifesting it, and their own set of practices. But my sense is that the basic phases of the journey are the same in all cultures. Sometimes we call that the deep structure is the same. And as I think I mentioned at Animus Valley Institute, we've been creating our own unique manifestation. It's a Western contemporary version of that. But so maybe I should say that the core experience that is included, that is a part of, an essential part of the journey of soul initiation, is what we call the descent to soul. And I actually even wanted to title the book that, The Descent to Soul, because that's really what the book's about. But my very wise editor at the publishing house said, nah, people get turned off by the word descent, which I don't know how true that is. But at any rate, the descent to soul is the core spiritual experience that goes downward, obviously. And every journey of soul initiation has at least one descent, sometimes several. And you can have a descent or descents to soul after the journey of soul initiation. But the key thing about the descent to soul, it's the spiritual adventure during which, if it goes well, we have a glimpse of our unique ecological niche. And we have that glimpse, as I've been saying, by way of a mythopoetic identity, a mythopoetic image, or a pattern that we experience. So see if I can do this briefly. The descent to soul, as we've learned about it through guiding it for 40 years, we've come to understand that it has five phases of a descent to soul. And we use the analogy of what a caterpillar goes through in a cocoon, but also the analogy of Soul Canyon. So here in Southwest US, of course, we have the Grand Canyon and very many smaller versions thereof, thousands and thousands of them. And we guide many of our programs in these canyons. We hike in and spend some days there. So we've naturally used that as a metaphor for the descent to soul. And if you can see my hand here, there's five phases to going into a canyon. There's walking along the tableland before you get to the canyon. And then you get to the edge and you look down and you go, oh no, that looks pretty intense. And then you actually do go down into the canyon. That's the second phase. We call it dissolution, first phase, preparation. Second phase is dissolution. Third phase is being at the bottom, which is when the soul encounter happens, that glimpse of mythopoetic identity. And the fourth phase is metamorphosis, going up the canyon wall on the other side. And the fifth phase we call enactment. And that's you're up at the top of the canyon again, and now you're walking back to your people, back to the village. Let's see, I'm just going to fix something here. Okay. Really briefly, the first phase is preparing psychospiritually and physically for the journey. And then the second, dissolution, is where the early adolescent ego is essentially dismembered. And which is to say that we lose our belief in the social role or the job, if we had one, that we were inhabiting. And there's something even bigger that happens then that we've never experienced before, if this is your first descent. And that is, we lose our faith that we could ever identify ourselves ever again in terms of a social role or a religious faith or a spiritual discipline or a job or a creative project. That we're heading into a zone that we've never been before, which is the mystical realm of the more than human world. Okay, so that's the second phase. Third phase is that experience, that glimpse of mythopoetic identity. And then the fourth phase is essential. And when we didn't understand this, I didn't understand it well enough until the last 6 or 7 years. Metamorphosis, which is going back up the other canyon wall. Metamorphosis is when our ego is shapeshifted from an early adolescent ego into an adult ego. Because the vision, the soul encounter, the revelation is not primarily information. It's not like, okay, here you've got your description of your true job in life or something like that. It is not that kind of thing. It does hold some information, but the main thing, that mystical encounter, that vision, starts shape-shifting our ego as if that ego is like clay in a potter's hand, and the potter is soul or mystery, and it's going to reshape our consciousness to become an adequate vehicle for the soul. Because an adult ego is an agent for soul, an early adolescent ego is an agent for itself. And if it's a healthy early adolescent ego, it's a healthy agent for itself, which in the contemporary world has become a rare enough thing, a healthy early adolescent ego. Hope that helps somewhat, Rachel.
Yeah. So we're missing something, aren't we? We have been missing something for hundreds of years, I would imagine, most of us in kind of these days. The instructions or even the knowledge about this, I'm guessing a lot of us go through this type of process on our own. How important do you think this is for us as individuals and for kind of the world generally?
Yeah, obviously very important. People do, in the contemporary world, people do go through this on their own. Sometimes it's relatively small percentage of people. But see, it's built, the structure of this experience, this descent to soul, is built into our very psyches. And so there's something in us that knows the pathway and that can help us along. The unfortunate thing is that most contemporary cultures actually suppress or make it very difficult to go through the journey. But the new book includes some stories of people who found their own way to go through it. This includes Carl Jung, who had no map for this experience and no guides. And based on his training, he figured he was probably going crazy, but he wasn't. He was on the descent to soul. I think in the Western world, we've probably lost our knowledge of these kinds of initiation processes thousands of years ago. So it's been quite a while. And the fact that there are people who find their own way into this anyways and actually survive it, some you may or may not survive it, but most people do. And I can say that everyone at Animas Valley Institute so far has, but I'm talking about people who go through this on their own. One is likely to be quote unquote rescued from the experience if you are starting to happen for you and your identity is starting to dissolve and you ask for help from most psychotherapists or physicians or educators or religious professionals. They're going to do their best to yank you out of Soul Canyon. And so unfortunately that happens quite a bit. Let's see, I think Rachel, go ahead.
An idea, sorry to interrupt you there, Bill. Could you give us an idea of how that feels? You know, how does knowing that you need to make the descent, I mean, I'm sure we all kind of know anyway, really, but could you give us some idea of how that can show up?
Yeah. First, I'll say that it makes all the difference whether or not you have a guide or an elder to support you. If you do, the guide or the elder will say, oh, this is what's going on for you. Congratulations. You've made it to this point in your life that, unlike most people in the world today. And these are the kinds of things you're going to be experiencing. And here's the practices that'll help you and so on. Okay, so people first experience or notice around the descent, especially if they don't have guidance, when the second phase is happening, which is the going down into the canyon, or it's an experience of falling, psycho-spiritually falling, dissolution of the old identity. And there's many patterns I've been tracking, and that's what the book is really about, in addition to lots of stories, is these various patterns that are common to people on the descent. One of the patterns in dissolution, second phase, are this combination of what we call the crisis and the call. So attempted briefly here, the crisis is, there's something in your life that is happening that is leading to a really wobbly identity, like the career you've been training for years. Suddenly you realize it isn't yours. That's what happened for me. I'd been training for years to be a research psychologist, and I was succeeding by all current standards, publishing lots of so forth. And I realized one day on top of a mountain in the winter in New York State that that as good as I was at doing that, it wasn't who I was. And like the rug was pulled out from underneath me. Other people have other kinds of crises. It could be the end of a romance, or it could be illness or an injury, or a loss of religious faith, and so on. There's all kinds of crises. And what the crisis does is it loosens our attachment to who we thought we were. And that has to happen for the descent to get anywhere. The second thing that happens at the same time at the crisis is the call from the depths. Joseph Campbell referred to it as the call to spiritual adventure. This is a kind of falling in love. And if it's our first descent, it's deeper and stronger, in some ways more erotic than any romance we've ever had before with another human. There's this tremendous pull to go down, to go into the depths. And it's the beginning, we may not know it at the time, but it's the beginning of the conscious love affair with the soul. Because the soul and the mature ego are deeply, deeply attracted to one another. The ego, of course, is attracted to the soul because the soul knows why we were born. The soul has the key to our deepest fulfillment in life, which is to say, the soul has the key to the greatest service we can provide the more than human world. And that's what we're all designed to seek, that, to want that. to swoon over that possibility. And then the soul is deeply in love with the ego it's associated with, because the soul by itself is not capable of manifesting anything in this world. Only the mature or the initiated ego can do that. And so the soul looks at the ego, which is now relatively mature. This is late adolescence. And don't confuse that with teen years. Again, most contemporary people don't reach late adolescence, but the soul looks at this relatively mature ego and says, whoa, here's a really competent being with a head and hands and resources to get things done, and actually can manifest the mystery of the soul. So those two things happen if crisis and the call. If the crisis doesn't happen, the adolescent ego is too strong to want to do anything other than continue on the path that it's been on. And if the call doesn't happen, then most egos can just avoid the descent. So those two are essential pieces. So that gives you a little glimpse of what a person starts experiencing when a descent is about to happen.
And what happens if you ignore the call, Bill? And I kind of ask this from a personal, for the individual, but also as a culture, what are some of the impacts of not doing this descent?
Yeah, if you're standing at the edge of the canyon with your toes wrapped around the top of the cliff there, and you say no, well, then you probably don't go down. That's one possibility. And you may never get another opportunity. Another possibility is you do get another opportunity. Another one is that you rarely weren't psychospiritually prepared anyway, so it was a good idea to say no right then and do some of this psychological and spiritual preparation. Another possibility, and this happens a lot, is you get abducted. You say no, and mystery says, ha ha, and metaphorically speaking, of course, a hand comes up through the earth, grabs you by the ankle, and down you go. We all know in the Greek myth of Persephone, that's what happened with Persephone. She was abducted by Hades. So those are some of the possibilities. And I heard your question actually a little bit more broadly than that. If enough people refuse the call, then the world becomes a wasteland. And that's what we're either in now or rapidly moving towards.
So do you think, I feel, because I'm such a huge fan, Bill, as you know, as I've said before many times, do you think, it feels to me that your work and this book is pioneering and kind of flag waving for something that really needs to happen at this moment? I know that this is something you've been doing for years, but it feels like what you've put in this book will really help people to understand why it's so important.
Yeah, I hope so. First, I'm going to say something that's a little bit to the contrary, and that is, I think individuals doing this kind of work, going on this journey, is not the most urgent thing in the world right now, because we're at this dire moment in the world, as I'm sure everybody knows, in terms of culture, in terms of our ecologically, in terms of everything. And the most urgent thing to do in the world right now is to save as much life as possible while the dominator imperial cultures collapse, which they're doing. For some of us, we feel that they're not collapsing fast enough, and there are some activists that are doing their best to help it collapse. And a lot of people who are doing their best, and a lot of organizations, as we all know, doing their best to save as much life as possible. That's most urgent. If we don't do well enough at that, we might not even save our own species. That's I could say the worst case scenario, perhaps. So that's what's most urgent. But given that, there's so much human individual suffering, psychological suffering, not to mention poverty and so on, and racial injustice and on and on and on. But psychologically, a very large percentage of people are suffering. And the kind of inner work, if you will, or psychological behavioral work that prepares somebody for a later descent to soul or the later journey of soul initiation, that kind of preparation happens to be the same things that help people get resourced enough that they can feel more and actually be more whole in their life and contribute more to their families and communities and so on. So, and this preparation work is, most of it is in my earlier book, Wild Mind. And I didn't make most of this stuff up, almost none of it. It's just Wild Mind compiles a bunch of practices and techniques and perspectives found all over the world, that most of which would be familiar to people. But it's a map of the whole spectrum. I call it the 4 facets of wholeness. And so my book, Wild Mind, I think puts more of it in one place than I've certainly seen before. So that preparatory work would be as useful as anything in the world right now to address this pervasive arrested human development that we've been kind of stuck with for so many centuries. So that's one reason, or a couple of reasons it's important. It also, the journey of soul initiation creates the foundations for a healthy culture, because healthy cultures are shaped by the work of initiated adults. And if you have a culture with very few initiated adults, you don't have a mature culture. That's, of course, the situation we're in. And if you don't have initiated adults, then you don't have many elders. And elders, this is incredibly brief, but my brief definition of elders are people who've been adults for 10 or 20 or more years and have been embodying and carrying their unique gift to their people. But as elders, we transition from a focus on providing our unique gift to being somebody, an elder, who cares for the soul of the more than human community, which one way to say that is elders are people who make sure the balance between the human village and the more than human world, the greater earth community, is maintained in a good way. Because adults are too busy doing their own unique thing, their soul work. And without elders, no one's taking care of the balance between the human world and the greater world. Very briefly, that's what true elders do. So let's see, why is it important? I'll just add one last thing. The journey of soul initiation is what leads to our deepest individual fulfillment, greatest personal joy, and also to our greatest service to the world. And so in terms of human fulfillment and the world being served, the journey of soul initiation is the path to being in the world in that way. Okay, so there's some, at least, why it's important.
Yeah. So other than read the book, Bill, and Wild Mind, which I can recommend as well, I love to kind of include in these discussions this element of advice. What would you be able to say to people? And I appreciate that's really difficult because we're all on a different stage of our own soul initiation. And actually you asked me not to ask you this question, and you gave me a brilliant answer to it. Do you remember when I said, what advice would you give to just becoming closer to soul? You said, unplug from the matrix and romance the world. And I just wondered if you could unpack that a little bit. What do you mean by that? Unplug the matrix and romance the world.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. I'll start by echoing the challenge to answer the question, which is, again, as you said, that people are in different stages. And those listening to us today, some may be in a healthy early adolescence and have some work of preparation. The developmental work of early adolescence is to create a social presence in the world that is fully authentic to your values, your interests, your style, and so on, and is socially acceptable in one place. And then others on this call will be in the cocoon. Some might already be on descent or already have had one. Others on this call will be in one of the two stages of adulthood or even elderhood. So, but I hear your question, Rachel, is saying, well, for people who either haven't been on the descent yet or are in one now, whether they're in that early adolescent stage, I call the oasis, or the late adolescent stage, I call the cocoon. What can they do? And yes, I remember those are the two answers I gave. That, and these would be relevant probably to people in either stage. First one was unplug from the Matrix. I assume everybody knows those films, the Matrix films. And so the Matrix is the contemporary mainstream consciousness and culture. And it's designed to keep us from growing up. I think actually literally designed to keep us from growing up, and it's very effective. Most mainstream religions, educational systems, family structures, politics, and so forth are all really effective to keep people from growing up. And that's the idea, because children and early adolescents are relatively easy to manipulate, and adults and elders are difficult. And so when a culture starts to decay, what the authoritarian leaders will do is do their best to kill the elders and the initiators, and to eliminate the initiation processes and all the cultural elements that tie people directly to the greater Earth community. Okay, so unplugging from the Matrix is unplugging from that. Unplugging from, I call it the conformist consumer society. And how do you unplug from that? There's long chapters in a couple different of my books about that, but things like you unplug from everyday superficial entertainment of our world, that, the bread and circuses part of our lives. And we keep that going a lot with the conversations we tend to have that other people tend to want to start with us. And so we start saying no to that world. We unplug as much as possible from being consumers and from being conformists and from that tug that we feel to be like everybody else, or like our people in a certain group. And one of the first things you do in the contemporary world is you unplug from social media, because as it's been said, many of the greatest minds of the last couple generations were abducted by the marketing and social media worlds to addict people to all kinds of consumer things. So one of the first things people tend to do, and this is unplugging from the Matrix, is sign off from Facebook, Twitter, whatever those various social media things are. If you're feeling a really big resistance to that, if you're someone who hasn't already said no to that, I know that it's ironic, probably there's a lot of people listening to us right now through Facebook, but you know what I mean by unplugging from it. So there's that aspect. And the second example, Rachel, I gave you was romance the world. So the world is not just the human world. One of the great things about our contemporary cultures is the flourishing and diversification of the arts and of science, and in many ways, of course, technology. There's a lot of beauty in Western culture, but psychospiritually, we've been decaying for quite a while. So, so when I say romance the world, in addition to being engaged in the true arts and sciences and so forth, is to get yourself out into as wild or semi-wild places as you can. Even in cities, you can find wildness is there growing up through the cracks, and the trees and the birds are still there and so on. So romancing the world is letting yourself fall into the love affair with this more than human world, because each one of us was designed for this world, and we came from this world. We've emerged from this world through our mothers, and it's the most natural thing is to be in love with this world. And one thing we do at Animas, one of the many practices that come under romancing the world, is we encourage people to go out and praise everything other than human. You can include humans if you want, to praise it as authentically as you can out loud, and maybe memorize poems, yours or others, that help you fall in love with this world. Like, all human children are born being hopelessly in love with the more than human world. And it's only through egocentric educational and religious systems that tear children away from that natural love affair. So in some ways, romancing the world is letting yourself be a child again, and to fall into wonder and praise. That's a really brief version of, probably a 50-page chapter on romancing the world.
Thank you. I'd love to open it up to questions now. So at the risk of becoming very hectic, if you have a question for Bill, I've given you 2 ways to ask, but what we'll do is take some questions from people who want to raise their hand electronically. If I or Faze says your name, then you can unmute yourself and ask Bill directly. And also the chat is open, so if anybody would prefer to put their question in there, then we will try and monitor them, although I imagine it's going to shoot down when people start asking. So is there anybody who would like to ask a question and put their hand up? Maybe if we go that way first. And I'm sure we will have some. They just sometimes take a little while. Mungo, do you want to unmute yourself?
Hello. My question is, you mentioned some of the ways in which we can be kept in this adolescence or pre-adolescent state. And if we're into the descent stuff, then kind of seeking psychological help can be counterproductive. I'm wondering, to what degree would you kind of caution against seeking psychotherapeutic help? To what degree is it kind of inhibitive of this process, or does it depend entirely upon who you see and what's going on?
Yeah, really good and important question. If you're in this early adolescent phase, which starts in our teen years, and for most people it lasts the rest of their life, and it's a great stage to be in, by the way. It's a healthy version of it. If you're in that stage, then finding and you're working with psychological challenges, then finding a great psychotherapist, a good one, is so helpful. And then I have to add, finding a really good psychotherapist can be really difficult, because the easiest thing to do in a psychotherapy role is to play the role of a rescuer who treats their clients as victims of other people or abuse and so forth. So there's a lot of rescuing of victims going on in lieu of psychotherapy, under the name of psychotherapy. And so we have to be really careful about that when we get stuck in a victim place, victim consciousness, it feels great to have someone affirm that we really were victimized. And it keeps them coming back to the rescuer psychotherapist. So that's something, of course, we want to avoid. we want to work with psychotherapists, it's almost impossible to say it briefly, but who really see our magnificence and who are committed to helping us into our wholeness and have the tools to help us into our wholeness. Again, my book, Wild Mind, tries to introduce that kind of idea that wholeness-oriented psychotherapy is relatively rare, unfortunately. It tends to be symptom-oriented instead. Okay, if you're in the cocoon, and maybe this is what you're actually asking, and the descent is starting to happen, would a psychotherapist be helpful? Well, first thing to say is a soul initiation guide would be way more helpful, because virtually no psychotherapists are also soul initiation guides. It's very different. The descent to soul is not only not therapeutic, it's counter-therapeutic. The descent to soul will undermine your current adaptation to your social circle, to your career, etc., to the consumer conformist society. It'll undermine all of that. If you're not psychologically prepared for the descent to soul, it can be a really, really rough ride. And some people don't survive it. As I say, we haven't had any suicides at Animus Valley Institute, but we know about such things. And they're generally, it's for people who weren't prepared. If you're not prepared for the descent and need to do more of the psychological or spiritual preparation work, then a talented psychotherapist can certainly be very helpful. A soul initiation guide can also help you with those kinds of things. One last, just to sharpen that point just a little bit more, in early adolescence, and even when early on in the cocoon stage of late adolescence, probably the single most important thing for psychological health is to have a really tight social circle and really good empathic and compassionate relationships with other humans. That's so essential to in early adolescence. And if it's the case, in my guess, that 80% of humans now in most societies are in early adolescence, and that's why psychologists are saying as clearly as we can that isolation, social isolation, is a really bad idea. And during this COVID pandemic time, there's a lot of people being more socially isolated than they would be otherwise and running into really serious problems. Now, I'm saying that because for those who are in the cocoon and a descent is happening, and if you're psychologically prepared for it, then I'm, or any other soul initiation guide, is going to recommend to you the exact opposite. We're going to say that you need to be alone now as much as you can, and you need to say goodbye to your social circle for the most part, because it's your social circle that's going to reinforce your current adolescent identity. And you're going to be rehearsing it constantly in the presence of your best friends. I hope everybody heard me carefully in the whole thing I said, that if you're not on a descent and or you're not psychologically prepared for it, do not socially isolate. If you are, that's one of the things you're going to have to do. Okay, thanks for the question.
Something that's coming up a lot in the chat, Bill, and you may have covered it, I've been so busy looking at the chat. Trauma. What's the relationship between trauma and the descent? And I guess we are in trauma collectively at the moment. Yeah. I mean,
well, first I'm going to apologize for my American accent, and I'm going to pronounce it trauma.
Okay.
I prefer yours, but it would be it would not be genuine if I did it. Okay, so trauma is, as we all know, is this. All of us have trauma in our lives, and it's way greater than it would be if we were in a healthy culture. And being that we're in this crux time of cultural collapse now, the trauma is really quite significant for all of us. And that's not even including, it does include all the personal trauma from earlier in our lives as we were growing up, and all the ancestral trauma that never got addressed and assimilated. Because we've been living in cultures that just don't know how to do that. So now I have to go sideways here a little bit and say what I understand trauma to be. And I'm basing this on the approach of trauma specialists over the last 20, 30, 40 years, that we have learned so much about trauma through people like Peter Levine and others. But in particular, I've been reading the work of Gabor Mate, who's a Canadian physician who's written some amazing stuff about trauma. And I'll try to put it briefly. He says, or he reminds us, that trauma is not actually the overwhelming experiences of being hurt physically or psychologically or spiritually by others, or not by others, by events. That's not what actually trauma is. Trauma is what we do almost always unconsciously inside ourselves to protect us from those overwhelming experiences in our past. In other words, what we might call traumatic experiences are those that we are not psychologically equipped to be able to assimilate. We just don't have the resources yet to be able to do it. And so there's parts of our psyches that protect us from the memory of the experience and or the somatic memory of the experience, one or both. And at Animas Valley Institute, we call those inner protectors, we call them subpersonalities or inner protectors, and there's 4 categories of them. This is explained in my book, Wild Mind. And the most common inner protector when it comes to trauma are escapists. I'm just going to fix the view here. Okay, so our escapists keep us from experiencing that overwhelming traumatic experience, somatically or emotionally or both. It separates us from that. So the way to heal from that, this is very, very brief, is that we need to first get ourselves into our wholeness. You might say our centered place, our place of wholeness, and not hijacked or stuck in those inner protectors. And people who are suffering from lots of trauma we call it hijacked by an inner protector. And you can't heal from your trauma when you're hijacked. So a good trauma therapist will help us get into our wholeness. And then when we're ready, and that phase takes quite a while, but at some point when we're ready, we can revisit those overwhelming experiences, staying in our wholeness and being held probably by a talented trauma therapist or even by a whole community. And we can assimilate that emotion, that overwhelming experience that we weren't able to earlier. And that not only makes us whole, there's often a deep spiritual or psychological treasure in that experience that we weren't ready for yet. Okay, so we can start healing from trauma in childhood, and obviously in early adolescence. In childhood, we definitely need support from others. In early adolescence, we probably do. And it seems that one of the patterns of human life is that as we progress to later, more mature stages of life, it's not like there's less trauma. In a certain way, there's more trauma, because the more mature we are, the deeper we can go in our healing, and the more the personal or ancestral trauma, more of that can be embraced and assimilated. So, for example, when people are on their first descent to soul, if they are probably
Have we lost Bill there, Faze? We've lost Bill. Let's give him a couple of moments to come back. We're
I'm
about
back.
4 minutes.
That was interesting.
Oh, Bill, it was you that left us. I was worried it was going to be me all along, but you went.
Yeah. I'm back.
So we have about 4 minutes left. You were in the middle of your conclusion on trauma. So
I actually completed it just then.
fantastic,
Yeah.
wonderful. Just super quickly, because there's been a lot of questions in the chat about this, unplugging from the matrix, and sorry to ask you to do this super quickly. Does that mean disengaging from political work? Does it mean disengaging from your job? Does it mean disengaging from your ability to raise children? How does unplugging from the matrix work for most of us?
Yeah, good question. No, it doesn't require any of those things. But first, we should say that in a healthy culture, and in the healthy ones we know of from the past, and maybe even still exist in certain places in the world, the journey of soul initiation probably starts in the mid-teen years. So it happens before a person is a parent, and before you have a job or a role in your community or your tribe that it would be hard for others to take over for you. So it happens relatively young. In some cultures that I've read about, it's said that the elders want to make sure you don't get too good at courting a potential lover before you've gone on the journey of soul initiation. Because basically you don't want to start a family before the initiation journey. So in the contemporary world, it isn't that way. Most people don't start their journey till their mid-20s at their earliest. This is in our experience at Adams Valley Institute. The late 20s, right around the first Saturn return, is a very common time for those who reach the cocoon to start their first descent. And for others, it may not be till their 30s, 40s, 50s, or later. So in other words, most people have a job, and they have people who depend on them having a job, like children or elderly parents or so on. So it makes it more challenging, the descent to soul, but it's possible. And at Animas, we've guided plenty of people in those circumstances. And what we coach them to do is to be in the world, but as little as possible of it. And that's possible to do. It is possible to withdraw from everyday social interactions for the most part. Some people take a leave of absence from the job if they can. Those who are fortunate, really privileged socioeconomically, might take a 3-6 month or so retreat. A lot of people can't afford to do that. But there are ways to support the descent, even if you're at home with a job, with children, and a partner. For example, Carl Jung. He started his descent when he was 36, approximately 35 or 6 years old. He had a psychiatric practice. He saw his patients in the home during the day. He had 5 children. He was married to Emma. He lived in a little village in Switzerland. And every evening he dedicated to his descent. And he managed to do it. And that first descent lasted 3 or 4 years. It's what he wrote about in the Red Book. But he was in the cocoon, you might be interested to know, 18 years, age 34 to 52. He didn't use those words like cocoon, but if you read his memoir, very clear that he was in the cocoon until his famous Liverpool dream when he was 52. So hopefully that gives you some encouragement. If Carl Jung could do it, you can do it. And you've got an advantage that he doesn't have, that if it happens for you, when it happens for you, you'll know what's going on. And you even have a book that will help you as a field guide to get through it. Carl didn't have that. Okay, I see we're close to the top of the hour now.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Bill. I'm going to apologise to Peter and Jill because you've had your hands up and I would love it if we had more time to ask. I know you've got a great question, Peter, at least, which has come up in the chat. Perhaps this is something that we can continue on Facebook or come along to the masterclass that we're doing with the Animus Guides at the end of February.
Yes.
But meantime, Bill, take care. It's lovely to see you. Journey well. We haven't managed to give you any cake this time. I know you enjoy English cakes, so
Yes, I'll take the IOU, and
okay.
you have to pay it back in double or triple because of the weight that I'll be suffering, but it's okay.
Okay, that's a promise. Okay, lovely to see you, Bill. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming. And yes, journey well, everybody. Perhaps if people want to unmute just to say goodbye, that might be a good way to finish. Goodbye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Cheers. Thanks, Bill.
Bye.
Thanks,
Bye.
everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Cheers.
Everyone.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, Iowa.
Thank you so much.